Hello, welcome, and thanks to everyone who is listening to us and for joining us in the latest in our series. The Historical Association, the History Department at Plymouth University and the Arts Institute have put together this series, and it's good that you've joined us this morning in Britain and for our speaker this evening. Hello, everyone. As I say, today is the first day of the Plymouth History Festival, which runs till the 30th of May. Check that out on the website, Plymouth History Festival. This current series of talks began in October, and thanks to everyone who's been concerned with that. I'm Alan Cousins from the Historical Association. Now, after the talk, we hope that some of you will want to ask questions and enter discussions with the speaker, Liz Rushen. And there are going to be two possibilities there. Either use the raise hand button on your screen, and we'll call on people to ask their question. Or if you think of a question, you can use the Q&A button on your screen and write it there. Now, you can all see Liz Rushen there. Dr. Rushen, we welcome her to give her talk on the enigmatic John Marshall, founder of Plymouth Emigration Depot at Baltic Wharf. Dr. Rushen is a director of the Melbourne Maritime Heritage Network. She's on the board of the History Council of Victoria, and she's a research associate in the School of Historical Studies at Monash University. Her PhD is in history from Monash. Her research projects include immigrant bounty women, and her research includes the creating of a database of women who migrated to Australian colonies from Great Britain and Ireland. She's published widely in the field of migration history and women in colonial Australia, and her books include Single and Free, Female Migration to Australia, 1833 to 1837. And her most recent book is a biography, John Marshall, Lloyd's reformer, ship owner, and emigration agent, published by Anchor Books. And that's what Liz will be talking about today. So over to you now, Liz.
Thank you, Alan. I'll just share my screen to start off. Lovely. Thank you for your warm welcome. And as you would realise, and perhaps some of the participants, that we've been waiting a year to deliver this paper. So I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for your warm welcome, Alan. No doubt this view is very familiar to many of you, the remnant of Plymouth Emigration Depot on Baltic Wharf, where hundreds of thousands of 19th century emigrants spent their last night ashore before boarding their ships for the new worlds of Australia, New Zealand, North America, Canada, and the Cape of Good Hope. John Marshall founded the Emigration Depot in 1835, and it became the template for later government emigration depots at places like Birkenhead and Deptford. Yet few people have heard of John Marshall today. Born in Yorkshire one spring morning in 1787, by 1810, John Marshall had moved to London. Between 1811 and 1838, he owned or part-owned 30 ships, totalling over 8,000 tonnes, ranging in size from the 146-tonne Venus to the 436-tonne Maria. The pattern of his ship owning illustrates how a self-made man could amass great wealth by reading the markets and turning risks into opportunities. Beginning with the Baltic trade, moving through to the Caribbean, then to India and the East when the opportunity first arose, finally reaching his zenith in Australasia, Marshall's ships traded throughout the world. His entry into the London world of shipping showed impeccable timing. The lifting of the embargo on ships sailing eastward from the Cape of Good Hope, when the East India Company lost its monopoly in Asia in 1813, relieved long contested restrictions on private trade and led to an influx of British traders to the east, including Australasia. At the same time, with the growth of the Australian colonies, the demand for goods rose and Sydney became a base for the increased traffic entering the Pacific. The development of the colonies saw a hunger for an ever-increasing array of consumer goods. In 1827, Marshall's whaler Harmony became the first ship to land New Zealand timber in London. In nearly 20 years of ship owning, Marshall did much to promote the Australian colonies and gained financially from exporting passengers and goods and importing Australian commodities such as wool, wheat and whale oil. He had spread his risk between the world's markets in his careful adjustments of the percentages of ships he owned, by his partnerships with family members and his favoured captains, and by chartering to the government and the powerful East India Company. Marshall demonstrated how an entrepreneur could begin with one vessel and with luck and good management could develop a viable fleet. While Marshall's business interests were expanding, he became actively involved in the Merchants and Shipowner Society, now called the London Shipowners and River Users Association, and it was through this platform that he pushed for reform of Lloyd's dual shipping registers. The first register of ships was published in 1764 for London's underwriters to provide information on the condition of vessels insured and chartered. Only members of the society could look at the register, and they were fined if others were shown it. By the end of the 18th century, ship owners were complaining about their exclusion from access to the register, and they published a rival book called the New Register of Book of Shipping. Named for the colour of their bindings, inevitably the two books battled for supremacy, ship owners and underwriters contesting classification rights and procedures, until the dispute between the red and green books escalated to the point of mutual insolvency. By splitting the market between them, both registers were on the point of ruin. The London Shipowner Society was actively involved in changes relating to the improvement of the laws of shipping, trade and navigation. The number of sailors lost each year was rising, and as shipping disasters multiplied, official concern grew about the safety of life at sea. At the 1824 annual meeting of the Society, Marshall accepted membership to the committee. As a major London ship owner, John Marshall saw that too many lives and cargoes were being lost through misinformation provided in the separate registers, and he proposed their fusion. Lloyd's was going through a bleak time, stretched during the financial crisis of 1825, facing a falling market in marine business and internal dissension about the way in which Lloyd's was managed. Year after year, Marshall continued his agitation for reform, winning over opponents by explaining that he envisaged that the new register would not be a profit-making concern. All its resources would go towards perfecting its organisation. On the 21st of October, 1834, Marshall finally had the satisfaction of seeing the formal unification of the two registers as Lloyd's Register of British and Foreign Shipping. This name remained unchanged for 80 years until the outbreak of the First World War, when the words British and Foreign were dropped, and Lloyd's Register of Shipping is now available online. The heated arguments in achieving these changes reveal the little understood closeness at that time of the two organisations known today as Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, and Lloyd's Register, responsible for the classification and registration of ships. Due to his prominent role, in 1833, Marshall was offered a position on the managing committee of Lloyd's Register, but he declined in favour of his business interests with Australia. The rules and regulations for the classification of ships published in the Register provided the framework of the new system of ship classification. They were based on the system, which had been in use for some time, of vowels for the ship's hull and numerals for the equipment of masts, spars, rigging, cables and anchors. Marshall's committee tightened the use of the classification A1, an expression still used today to denote first class. By restructuring ship classification and the publication of this information in a combined register, Marshall had earned widespread respect, demonstrated by invitations to give evidence to several parliamentary committees inquiring into the state of shipping. When he appeared in 1836 before a government-appointed select committee to inquire into the causes of the increased number of shipwrecks, he revealed that most of his observations regarding the registration of shipping had been adopted, but not all. He thought that the new system could be improved even further if Lloyd's took into consideration, quote, the real efficacy of a ship rather than the sole principle of age. The system developed under John Marshall's leadership helped Britain to achieve the position of the world's leading maritime power. By 1834, when the new register was published, Marshall's shipping interests had taken a turn towards emigration, and he commenced working as agent to the London Emigration Committee under banker Edward Forster. Marshall's contribution to immigration and to the safe passage of 19th century migrants was no less considerable than his work with Lloyd's Register. His involvement highlights the complex relations between the imperial and colonial governments and paid contractors, while revealing that the role of private enterprise in the peopling of Australia was crucial before the gold rushes created a storm of new arrivals in the 1850s. Without the participation of John Marshall, the great agent of 26 Birchen Lane, Cornhill, assisted migration to Australasia may not have been conducted so safely. It was the conversion of two government decisions which allowed emigration to take off. The 1831 decision to fund emigration from the sales of Crown land in the colonies, that is, the Ripon regulations, and new poor law clauses which came into force in 1835, which provided the machinery for parish emigration of families. This is where John Marshall would concentrate his efforts for the next 5 years, becoming the best known and major emigration agent in the Australian trade. In May 1835, the 510-ton ship Canton was one of the London Emigration Committee ships, was forced to stop at Tor Bay for 9 days. With 340 passengers, 170 of whom were single bounty women, already the passage of the Canton had been difficult. When the ship departed Gravesend, it ran into a fishing smack and destroyed its mast. Then contrary winds forced a laborious 10-day passage down the channel. While at Tor Bay, the matron resigned, but in many ways the layover was fortuitous as they took on additional drinking water and Marshall delivered additional fresh meat to the ship. Leaving Tor Bay, the Canton sailed around to Plymouth, and it was at this stage that Marshall saw the possibilities for a permanent lodging place for emigrants. He realised that it would be more convenient for passengers from the south of England to embark directly at Plymouth, rather than travel to London and suffer as the ship made its way down the channel. Plymouth was also a convenient port for the steamers which brought emigrants across the Irish Sea from Dublin and Cork. And once there, all the passengers waiting to embark would need somewhere to stay. At this time, the Navy's victualling yard on Baltic Wharf had become too small to cope with the needs of the expanded British Navy, so the Ordnance Board had moved to the newly built Royal William Victualling Yard at Stonehouse. The buildings on Baltic Wharf were leased to Thomas Gill, and John Marshall obtained a sublease from Gill, converting some of the former government buildings into a lodging house for emigrants, paying for those changes with his own money. Situated below the Royal Citadel, Marshall's depot on Baltic Wharf was in an ideal position for housing emigrants. Not only was the position on the wharf picturesque, but it was also considered to be healthy, and good quality water could be taken on board for the emigrants' use during the voyage. Marshall renovated the buildings at his own expense to accommodate up to 600 emigrants, but often did not operate at capacity in the early years. On census night, 1841, for example, Marshall's depot catered for only 267 Irish emigrants. He set it up much like on board ship, providing a communal dining room and washing facilities on the ground floor and separate dormitories for married couples, single men and single women on the first floor. The day-to-day management of the depot was undertaken by local man William Seward, whose wife Mary was the matron. An account by a man who emigrated to Australia stated that the emigrants were, quote, received most kindly by the superintendent. The matron received the females and was equally kind and attentive. 3 substantial meals were provided during the day, and dinner consisted of an abundance of excellent beef and vegetables. The writer described how the emigrants were interviewed by the government immigration officer, Lieutenant Timothy Carew, Royal Navy RN, concluding, the food is abundant and excellent, and the bedding is clean and ample, and proper rules are laid down for the preservation of cleanliness in the depot. A major boost came to Marshall when the government designated London and Plymouth as the 2 official immigration ports for the colonies. It was a huge advantage for immigrants to be safely housed while waiting to depart, and the first group of government immigrants were lodged in Marshall's depot in 1842. Stephen Walcott, secretary to the Colonial Land Immigration Commissioners, informed Marshall that they felt no hesitation whatever in preferring the use of your depot for immigrants to that of public houses. Immigration was enormously valuable to the town, with provisions for depots supplied by local traders, and many immigrants obtained outfits and their immigration needs at nearby stores. As reported by the Daily News, the immigration trade was worth an estimated £200,000 to Plymouth. John Marshall developed a well-oiled procedure for sending out immigrants, building up a network of agents in Britain and the colonies. His agents in the southwest of England included James Wilcox, a solicitor of Plymouth, who later took over Marshall's business, and other men spread throughout the southern counties. In Ireland, his major agent was John Bernard. Bernard became known as the poor man's friend for his work in assisting people to migrate before the Great Famine, and his National Library of Australia has this fine portrait of him. Largely due to the facilities provided at his depot on Baltic Wharf, by the mid-1840s, Plymouth had become the 3rd largest passenger port in the United Kingdom, after Liverpool and London. Indeed, Marshall's depot stimulated the expansion of privately funded immigration from the port. Marshall continued to charter first-class ships for immigrants. When the trade was at its peak, each month he advertised the departure of an immigrant ship to various parts of the expanding British Empire. His ships provided superior accommodation for immigrants and paying passengers, and each ship would depart at the advertised time, an important consideration as laydays were expensive. His good standing in immigration affairs ensured that eminent paying passengers, such as Bishop Broughton, travelled to Australia on Marshall's ships, and the new governors of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land also travelled to their postings via his ships. Sir John Franklin on the Fairlie in August 1836, and Sir George Gipps on the Upton Castle in May 1838. Governor Gipps later thanked Marshall, writing, "Everything that depended on you was done with great liberality and good judgment. A more comfortable ship I never was on board of. I wish you success in all your undertakings." Marshall was a master at logistics, and all the ships he secured were large, rated A1 by Lloyd's, and he constantly worked to improve the voyage experience for his passengers, even inventing a stove to heat food. His ships were well run with few fatalities. Lloyd's statistical returns of losses at sea indicate that each year over 500 ships were lost through either natural events, negligence, or both. Many ships were lost to fire, shipwreck, or other hazards, but all Marshall-owned or Marshall-chartered ships arrived safely, discharging their passengers in Australia, which is an outstanding record. In 1840, transportation to New South Wales ceased, and as the colony still needed labour, Governor Gipps pushed the entire land fund towards immigration. But in London, he was castigated for his extreme improvidence at a time when, due to drought, the colonies were left with a shortage of capital. This, combined with large borrowings and high interest rates, resulted in many bankruptcies. Building works were halted, commercial life was at a standstill, and the ports were nearly empty of vessels. The income from land sales had diminished so much that the government was forced to suspend the bounty system. Unfortunately for John Marshall, during 1841, he had organised a dozen ships to sail to the Port Phillip district, now known as Victoria, and was unable to receive bounties for these migrants. But he wasn't the only one to be affected. His shipping colleagues were all impacted, like his old friend and soon-to-be Lord Mayor of London, John Pirrie, as well as Duncan Dunbar, Robert Brooks, John Gore, and Thomas Ward, who were all affected by the recession, but had lucky escapes from bankruptcy. Marshall wasn't so lucky, and by his own admission, he had invested too heavily in the Australian trade, sending too many goods on consignment, and he had warehouses filled with items which were impossible to move. His was one of the most spectacular crashes, and his failure became big news. The Sydney Herald editorialised that Marshall appeared to have been influenced not by a sordid desire for gain, but by a wish to do good, and he ought to be looked upon as a benefactor to the colony. In January 1842, Marshall passed through the London Court of Bankruptcy with debts estimated to £111,000, or equivalent to about £12 million today. When his certificate of bankruptcy was issued, Commissioner Williams praised Marshall's honour, integrity, and humanity, writing that the disaster which wrecked the prosperity of Australia also wrecked this respectable and meritorious man. Due to Marshall's bankruptcy, his contract with the commissioners for the depot at Plymouth was not renewed until 1846, by which time John Marshall's son Frederick was involved in the business. Once the government renewed their immigration contract, the number of ships increased. In 1847, 26 ships departed from Plymouth, and in 1848, it was 89 vessels. In 1849, 130 emigrant ships left the harbour with over 15,000 passengers, most going to Australia. That year, there was a great risk of cholera in Britain, and typhus had claimed the lives of many emigrants bound for America. When Lieutenant Carew reported on the hygiene arrangements at Marshall's depot, he assured the commissioners that all necessary precautions had been taken to ensure that passengers would not take the disease on board ship. The health record of the depot remained good throughout the period of heavy immigration in the wake of the Irish famine, and in 1852, Carew told an inquiry that during his 5 years as immigration officer in Plymouth, there had been only 25 deaths at the depot. At this time, Marshall added an extra string to his bow by joining the established Emigration Trade Canada, and he continued to improve and streamline the process of migration. The new system worked well for him. The sailing season to Canada was March to July, for Adelaide, June to August, to the Cape of Good Hope, October, November and January. And of course, he could fill the ships with freight on the return trip. From Canada, the major cargo was, of course, timber. From Australia, it was wool, while ships to the Cape could travel to the east, to India and the Far East for fabrics and spices. In the early 1850s, the Immigration Commissioners considered changing their preferred immigration depots from Deptford and Plymouth to new depots at Nine Elms, London, and Southampton. The Southampton Town Council submitted 2 tenders, but they were unsuccessful, and Frederick Marshall, John's son, was awarded the tender for Plymouth. Although they dabbled with the prospect of opening their own depot at Plymouth, the Commissioners continued to support the Marshalls' impressive setup, remarking that, after a careful inquiry, we believe we may without hesitation assert that they have been, generally speaking, very successful. But the Immigration Commissioners applied a vital condition. The Plymouth depot was to be exclusively used for government immigrants sent by them. By 1851, the depot had virtually transitioned into a government-controlled institution. With the daily management of the Plymouth depot in Frederick's hands, Marshall turned his focus to a new venture, coal. In Reading, Berkshire, John Marshall formed the Great Western Coal Company and built up another business empire, with over 40 outlets supplying much sought-after coal throughout the south of England. Before that venture, too, went belly up through poor financial advice and the avarice of his chief clerk. In 1840, John Marshall had been caught in the catastrophic recession in Australia. In 1851, he had spread himself too thinly and was bankrupted for a second time. And in 1857, when Marshall knew he was heading for bankruptcy for a third time, he made an arrangement with his clerk, Arthur Hill, to look after the Plymouth Immigration Depot for him. It was an attempt to avoid losing this profitable business, but Hill called Marshall's bluff and took total control of the depot and all Marshall's businesses. The year 1857 started badly for Marshall. As winter was slowly drawing to a close, he was in the midst of battling in the bankruptcy court to retain his coal business, and with his Plymouth depot under, he thought, the watchful eye of Arthur Hill, Marshall looked to re-enter the business he knew best, the emigration trade. However, the nature of emigration had changed following the gold rushes to California in 1849 and to Australia in 1851. In response to these changes, the Immigration Commissioners announced the individual Australian colonies would appoint emigration agents to oversee the selection of immigrants from Britain. Marshall made one last desperate stab at involvement in emigration and published a long pamphlet spruiking his credentials to the colonial governments, titled Facts and Proceedings Relating to Emigration to the Australian Colonies, and printed in Reading by J. Macaulay in May 1857. The publication of this pamphlet was to be Marshall's ultimate undoing. Excuse me. But Marshall had a problem. In December 1856, when he had asked his clerk, Arthur Hill, to take control of the depot until he could get on his feet again, no definite terms were agreed for handing back the depot. It is one of the tragedies of Marshall's declining years that he trusted Hill, even to the extent of making Hill one of his executors. Marshall later stated, "I always viewed him as holding the Plymouth Immigration Depot, to use his own repeated words, for the good of my family, and I relied entirely, so soon as I should be in circumstances legally to hold it, that Mr. Hill would act in accordance with the obvious sense and spirit conveyed in these words." When Marshall's bankruptcy settlement was being made at the office of the official assignee, Mr. Whitmore, Hill was assisting Whitmore and was one of Marshall's sureties. According to Hill, he was made an offer, quote, to take whatever depots he pleased at a valuation by the court broker. Hill paid £212 for the Plymouth depot fixtures and £5 for the lease to the end of the following year. As he later wrote to Marshall, He accepted this offer and purchased several coal depots and the Plymouth Emigration Depot purely for the good of your family, because he felt for their position that in the event of your becoming bankrupt, if the Plymouth Depot should pass into my hands, I would let you have it again when you should be free to take it. Trusting Hill, Marshall accompanied him to the office of the court's inspectors and requested that Hill be accepted as the operator instead of him, and the arrangements were complete. Marshall then wrote to Thomas Gill, MP, owner of the Plymouth Depot buildings, to regard Hill as his tenant for the remainder of the lease until Christmas 1857. Having taken over control of the depot, Hill had a sudden windfall. A ship filled with emigrants from Liverpool was in distress and had to call into the depot unexpectedly. By providing food and shelter for the emigrants, Hill received nearly £700 from the government. It was an enormous sum of money for Hill, whose annual salary was £200, and he realised that he could make good money by retaining the depot. From this time on, Hill used Marshall's demise for his own aggrandisement. Believing he was the true operator of the depot, and under the impression that Hill was acting for him, Marshall claimed a share in the £700. Hill knew that Marshall's hands were tied until his bankruptcy was resolved and his certificate issued, so he procrastinated about sharing the windfall and repeatedly fobbed off Marshall with excuses. It was a missed opportunity to financially aid the man who had given him his start in life, and it showed Hill's true colours. In May 1857, W.J. Seward, Marshall's long-standing supervisor of the depot, died, and when Hill sought Marshall's advice about his replacement, Marshall recommended his agent at Croydon, Mr. Clark, as the best qualified man he knew. Marshall later used this exchange to vindicate his view that Hill was holding the depot in good faith until he could resume control. However, Hill ignored Marshall's advice and appointed Seward's son, Harry. Marshall was appalled, as Harry could neither read nor write, and Marshall believed that a person holding the chief management of a public establishment of such importance should be tolerably educated and duly qualified. Meanwhile, under the misapprehension that Hill had his best interests at heart, Marshall approached Hill to cover the costs of printing and posting his pamphlet on emigration, as Marshall was unable to summon even the £18 3 shillings and sixpence he owed the printer. Aware that Marshall had no funds, Hill put an unrealistic demand on him. He first required Marshall to reimburse him the £212 he had paid for the fixtures. Marshall asserted that if Hill had not initially agreed to pay for the pamphlet, he would not have incurred the liability of having it printed. When Marshall passed his bankruptcy in September 1857, he met with Hill to make arrangements to take back control of the depot. At this meeting, Hill revealed that he had negotiated a continuation of the lease with Thomas Gill, and it became obvious to Marshall that Hill had no intention of handing back the depot. Hill's attitude and procrastination upset Marshall, and after several sleepless nights, in failing health, he paid a visit to Plymouth to speak with Gill. They had enjoyed a long business arrangement over the previous 20 years, and Gill expressed to Marshall that, had he known the real position, he would not have had dealings with Arthur Hill, and certainly would not have extended Hill's lease after Christmas 1857. He further confirmed that he thought he was negotiating with Marshall when he was dealing with Hill. Unsurprisingly, this news caused Marshall to have a relapse of his illness, and he was bedridden at Plymouth under medical treatment for a month. When he returned to Reading, he was again very ill. In the meantime, Gill wrote to Hill for clarification, writing, "In my negotiations with you, I have always considered that Mr. Marshall, though he could not personally negotiate, was to be regarded as a party in the agreement. Hill's curt response revealed the extent of his deception, revealing that he had left the name of the tenant blank, intending his name to be inserted in the more formal memorandum of agreement to follow. And so, by this sleight of hand, Arthur Hill gained control of the Plymouth emigration depot. It was to Marshall's everlasting misfortune that he trusted Hill. As Marshall remarked, Hill was a person who, by a sudden and perhaps unprecedented chain of extraordinary circumstances, found himself, from being a clerk, raised from the fact of the relations in which he had stood towards me, to be the sole possessor of the depots, trade equipments and advantages of the valuable connection of his late employer and implicitly confining friend. With Hill having taken over the Plymouth emigration depot and Marshall's considerable coal business, in a final spurt of energy, Marshall became the sole agent for various shipping companies to America and the White Star Line to Australia. With the American Civil War commencing that year, westward emigration had slowed, but in this age of the clipper ships, Marshall presented the Australian colonies as an unlimited field for enterprise. But it was too late for him. He was old, had been ill for some time, and was in his final decline. On the 16th of December, 1861, his long struggle ended and he died of old age, his family inserting just a brief note in the Berkshire Chronicle to mark his passing. Death, 16th of December, at Eldon Square after a long illness, Mr. John Marshall, in the 75th year of his age, formerly agent for emigration to the colonial governments. There was no eulogy and no obituary in the London newspapers for the former great art agent of Birchen Lane. The black borders around the newspapers that day didn't mark Marshall's passing, but the death of the Prince Consort, Prince Albert. All of England was in mourning, but not for Marshall. He was a forgotten man. In his lifetime, Marshall was acknowledged as performing a great service to New South Wales and the Port Phillip district through the increase in labour his tens of thousands of migrants had brought to the developing colonies. For 20 years, Marshall offered a complete migration package from departure at his Plymouth depot to arrival in the colonies. He was a master of logistics and established systems which ensured the safe passage of thousands of 19th century migrants. At a time when many ships were lost to fire, none of his suffered any of those disasters. But recognition of his contribution in this arena has been tarnished by the lingering criticisms of his detractors. Even his contribution in providing safe lodging for emigrants prior to embarkation has been erased. Articles in Plymouth newspapers, the Western Evening Herald of the 25th of March 1989 and the Evening Herald of the 6th of July 1991 praised the government for establishing the emigrant depot and for attending to the interests of emigrants by providing clean and safe accommodation while they were waiting to board their ships. However, it was John Marshall who saw the possibilities of the old Lambay victualling yard by establishing the first emigration depot in Britain, not the government. While Marshall had established and run the depot for the benefit and comfort of the emigrants, Hill was driven by profit. This was a very different motivation to Marshall's and ended with the depot being taken away from Hill for a time. 2 years after the Seward incident, when it was reported that there was a collapse in hygiene standards at the depot and the emigrants lived in austere conditions, the Immigration Commissioners closed it temporarily. This situation was in stark contrast to the years of Marshall's ownership, when the depot had an exemplary health record and was well managed. The emigration depot was such a good money spinner that Hill continued to expand it to over 1,100 places. The ambitious final renovation was completed 7 years before the depot closed permanently in 1890, and the premises were converted into a government torpedo depot. The buildings were finally demolished in 1934 to make way for a new road, and Baltic Wharf was destroyed in a bombing raid during the Second World War. Hill's life continued in an upward spiral. In 1879, he became a Reading councillor, serving as mayor from 1883 to 1887. He was described as an expert in financial matters who helped sort out Reading's financial situation, underlining the rapacity of his behaviour when Marshall was heading towards bankruptcy. The events of Marshall's later life have diminished recognition of his achievements for over 150 years, and he has slipped between the pages of remembrance. But his contributions to safe shipping and Lloyd's Register of Shipping, the development of trade between Australia and Britain, and the establishment of systems which ensured safe passage, including the establishment of the Plymouth Emigration Depot, deserve greater recognition. You can read more about John Marshall in my new book, as Alan mentioned, John Marshall, Shipowner, Lloyd's Reformer, and Emigration Agent. Note that I write under my full name, Elizabeth Rushen. All my books can be purchased from my publisher, Anchor Books Australia, or through Aid Books, or go to my website for further details. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. That was a very interesting story, Liz, and a sad end for Marshall. So many issues, though, which are raised from that story and those years, the great changes that happened in those years when Marshall was active. So, first of all, if there are people who are wanting to, I'm just trying to control my, people who want to raise their hands, use the raise hand button on your screen, and you'll find that under participants. And if you have a question, use the Q&A button. It looks as though, if I can get my Q&A thing up, it looks as though there could well be a person who has got a question. I can't get mine up.
Alan, I can read it from here.
Right, okay, good.
And the question's from Stephen, and it says, did John Marshall's Emigration Depot collaborate with the Plymouth Company of New Zealand, established in 1840, based at the Octagon on Union Street, or were they seen as rival organisations? Stephen, the emigration schemes, there were many immigration schemes in the 19th century to assist immigrants to migrate. And the Plymouth, the one that you mentioned to New Zealand, the Plymouth Company of New Zealand, was an immigration scheme. So the settlers going out to New Zealand under that scheme most likely stayed at the Plymouth Emigration Depot, particularly if they were from the southwestern counties. People who were migrating and lived in Plymouth would probably have no need to go to the depot, although it was a very good introduction to life on board ship. As I mentioned, they were berthed in wooden bunks, and their meals were served at the same time as they would have on board ship, and they would meet their fellow passengers. So perhaps all of them did. I don't know. I haven't been able to find any records of the names apart from that. The census, on census night, you can find who was actually at the Plymouth Emigration Depot. So the systems, the schemes for emigration were very different to the depot itself.
Thanks. And there's another question, which is the extent to which emigrants were, it says, was it purely paying emigrants? I think probably that has to do with the extent to which the emigrants themselves paid and what you know about bounties.
Yes, it was usually both bounty immigrants and who were assisted by the government to emigrate, and not so much paying passengers wouldn't have stayed at the immigration depot because they had their own resources. They could stay in local hotels or lodging houses or other places. It generally was, and as I said, was 1852, the government took total control of the immigration depot. So it was purely government assisted immigrants. Now, a bounty immigrant, there's often a lot of confusion about what is a bounty immigrant. The bounty was the sum equivalent to the fare of the passengers, and that was paid by the government to the agent, not to the people. The people immigrating didn't receive a bounty, didn't receive money. They received the effect of the bounty, which is a free passage, but they didn't receive any money. They were usually assured of employment when they arrived, and they were given usually a couple of days after the ship arrived, free, often on board the ship, to sort themselves out and find accommodation on land. But the bounty actually referred to money paid to the agents who are authorised by the government to assist immigrants to migrate.
Okay. Could I ask a question then, Liz? Just thinking about the sorts of people who were emigrating, you talked about a number of people from Ireland because they had been brought round by steamers and so on. Were there particular trades which they had to offer, or were there particular trades which were sought by people in Australia who wanted to attract new migrants to Australia?
That's a good question, Alan. The colonial governments frequently publicised the lists of trades they were looking for, and they generally ran to agricultural trades, building trades, that sort of thing, because they're trying to build up the colonies. On shipping lists, if you're familiar with looking at shipping lists of immigrants, you'll often see page after page of agricultural labour endlessly. Sometimes people stated their occupation was as an agricultural labourer in order to fit the requirements. I have seen lots of examples of that. The colonial governments didn't particularly, for example, at one stage want shoemakers, and I know a boot and shoemaker who wrote his occupation as a agricultural labourer, as did his son, who was educated in the classics, and he wrote himself his occupation as agricultural labourer. And so that was just to fit the requirements of the immigration commissioners. You could call it deception, but it's, they could still, clearly, if they had another trade, they could still work as an agricultural labourer. It didn't stop them working that way. If they had a profession or a trade, they could probably still do the work. So they fitted their circumstances for the regulations.
Thanks. And we have a question. There's Marshall, 3 times became bankrupt. The question is, what penalties did this incur?
Absolutely no penalties, except he wasn't allowed to trade until he had been discharged and received his certificate. It was quite common in the 19th century for particularly ship owners, but entrepreneurs, a lot of people went bankrupt, and bankruptcy didn't mean then what it means to us today. It was unfortunate, and no doubt he would have preferred not to have become bankrupt, well, particularly that first time. He was really unlucky to be caught, and he could have traded himself out of it. He had so many goods in Australia, and I mentioned that he had 14 ships on the high seas when he was declared bankrupt. So he wasn't actually able to claim the bounties for those people. Had he been able to do that, he would have been able to discharge all his debts. But there was one particular creditor, probably a competitor, but there was one creditor who wouldn't wait for the money to come back from Australia or for Marshall to be paid his money. And so he was declared bankrupt. and his friend John Perry, Sir John Perry, you know, as Lord Mayor of London, he was knighted because Queen Victoria, because was it Prince Edward was born that year, and he was that close to also becoming bankrupt, but he was involved in trying to assist Marshall. They were very close, John Perry and John Marshall.
I think it was in an advert that you showed us, Liz, about single women. Could you say something about women and their emigration and women and immigration into the Australian colonies, the extent to which people were looking for domestic servants, were looking for wives, and what sort of women actually went?
When Australia was first settled, when the first fleet came to Australia, in 1788, for the first 40 years, the British government really saw Australia as a penal colony. It didn't, or a penal settlement. It didn't really see Australia as a colony. But by the 1820s, they started to realise the possibilities of Australia becoming a colony, more a civil society. But before 1824, it was actually a crime under the British government statutes to encourage a labourer to emigrate. So they had to repeal that law, which they did in 1824. And then in 1831, the Ripon regulations came in, where the government decided, through work of some immigration commissioners, that they would fund emigration by the sale of Crown land in the colonies. And that was the key to opening up emigration freely to people. Once the government could work out how to transport people out there, so it wasn't a cost to the people, it was a free passage, they were able to recoup their money by selling Crown land. But after a few years of doing that, they realised that many more men were in Australia. Most of the convicts were male, the guards were male, the administrators were male. And in the 1820s, when there had been free emigration, it was mainly people men of means, gentlemen of means, like second sons and that sort of thing, people who had money and were looking to invest it somewhere. So there were at least 3 times, 5 times more men than women in the cities, in the towns. They weren't cities then, in the towns, and 20 to 1 in the bush. So an immigration commission was established in 1831 to look into that, and they decided to have free immigration of women, particularly target women. But first it was seen to be poor women, and so it sort of gave the scheme a bad name. But only 2 ships went out under the immigration commissioners. That was the Princess Royal from London to Hobart, and that was really organised by Elizabeth Fry. And Elizabeth Fry is much better known as the angel of the prisons, helping prison women in Newgate to read. But she also helped with the women on this ship. And then there was the Red Rover full of Irish women who went to Sydney. So the immigration commissioners realised that that was successful. And so the work was then passed to a charitable institute that Edward Forster, I mentioned before, the banker, was involved with. And the London Immigration Committee was formed. They sent out 14 ships, about 3,000 women and some family members. But the women were seen, the women came from all, as they called them, classes of society. There are a lot of unemployed governesses. And if you think of those lovely TV dramas that used to be on about 20 years ago, Jane Austen's books, that you used to see groups of women sitting in villages, ogling the single men who would ride into the villages. And there were a lot more women than men in Britain at that time. Now, Austen was writing about 1815, something like that. So it was a bit earlier than the period I'm talking about, but there were still a lot more women than men. They were called the redundant women. And so Britain had too many women, Australia didn't have enough. And so this scheme was meant to adjust the needs for both. But it was very much guided by the principles of Wakefield, which meant that under which Adelaide, he's better known for the guiding principles for the establishment of Adelaide and South Australia, but his principles were also used by the London Emigration Committee, which meant people from all, to form a balanced society, you need people from all classes, various occupations, mix of the sexes, balanced society. So that's what they're aiming for. And I argue in my book, Single and Free, that it was actually probably more difficult for the distressed governesses than it was for the distressed general servants or dairymaids or whatever. But you can imagine a girl who'd been working in a Georgian big Georgian house below stairs, taking on the challenge of immigration, not liking perhaps her employer, seeing the possibilities, going on a ship, and then going to a bark hut in the bush. It would have been extremely difficult for a lot of these women. But the stories are fantastic. They were really resilient. A lot of them really achieved enormously, establishing schools, all sorts of things. And their stories, I cover their stories in my book.
Thanks.
And Marshall was the agent for the London Emigration Committee.
Yeah. Okay, there's a comment from Mark Brachet. He extends his thanks in his not a question. He says he worked on the depot and emigration from Plymouth decades ago. Your work, he says, has filled in numerous gaps in the story. Excellent talk. I must get your book. One remaining question is, which bit of the old sprawling victualling complex was actually the depot? It obviously was only a portion of that victualling area.
Hello, Mark, and thank you for your comments about my talk. I have read some of your work, and it has informed my work as well, which I've recognised in my book. I don't know the exact answer to your question. I haven't compared the footprint. I do have the old design of the emigration depot, but it's actually a bit water damaged from years ago. I haven't damaged it with water. I have a photo of it, I should say. I haven't got the document. And so I can't actually answer your question, but it would be really fascinating to work out exactly the extent of the depot and what changes were made in what years. Clearly Hill did an enormous amount of work, but I have no idea what it actually looked like in 1935 when Marshall leased the property from Hill.
Okay, thanks. And there's a question from Rosie, the Arts Institute. How did agents promote and advertise emigration? Was it purely in the press? Were there other more targeted means? You talked about, you showed us pamphlet, talked about pamphlet. What sorts of ways was emigration promoted and encouraged?
Newspapers were clearly a major way, but some people were illiterate. So ministers and priests used to announce the schemes from the pulpit. And of course, letters home. Letters home were enormously influential in that era. And some people have written about the impact of returning letters back home, people gathering around in villages, reading the letters, hearing news. And letters were also extremely important, of course, as well to people in Australia to hear news from home. And so a lot of work's been done on letters. But of course, for the illiterate people migrating, it would have been extremely difficult. They wouldn't have had that opportunity. But I believe that the illiterate people heard about the schemes through pulpits, through talk, big posters. I think I put up a poster in my PowerPoint showing the posters that were produced to promote emigration. And of course, the lure of a free passage, and the reports by the 1830s, reports were going back to the UK on the wool, the wheat, the children were growing, you know, the healthier lifestyle that people were looking for.
I'm a bit ignorant about the timing of all this, and I'm interested. I live in Cornwall, and I'm interested in the fact that a lot of tin miners or former tin miners from Cornwall went to Mexico, to South Africa, to Australia as miners, maybe not mining tin there. Is that a bit late for the sort of period you've been looking at?
No, Marshall received the government approval for migration to South Australia when copper was found in Burra, South Australia. It's a Cornish town. In fact, several of my forebears came from Cornwall to Burra in South Australia, and then across to Victoria for gold in the 1850s. There was a huge movement of of Cornish people, because miners, there was coal in Newcastle, was discovered very early. There's quite a lot of coal around before then the gold finds of the early 1850s.
Any other questions from people? I've got one. Another not a question, which I will read out in a moment, but let's see whether no one else bursting. Well, Alan Butler has this to say, it's another not a question. What he would like to do is to thank you, Liz, and the Plymouth Historical Association, because this has made a wonderful start to the Plymouth History Festival, which Alan has been particularly involved with in organising, and which begins today. So before we finally finish,
Alan, before you do finally stop,
right.
Can I thank you for that and for that comment. One thing I noticed when I did visit, when I have visited Plymouth to do research, is that there are many, many, many plaques to people going to America. And there's very little mention of emigration to Australia, and it would be fabulous to see some sort of recognition and some sort of recognition on Baltic Wharf of John Marshall's work in establishing that place, because that depot was really highly regarded because of the fresh water, because it was considered healthy. And of course, it was a great boon to the town, which Mark mentions in some of his work as well, the money that was brought into the town through the development of the emigration depot. There's a challenge.
Yeah, it is. That's a very good point, because in recent years, Alan Butler, who we've just mentioned and who's one of the audience here, has been involved with others in self-guided walks around different parts of Plymouth, including that Barbican area. And this would be something which could well be, first of all, a plaque put up, and secondly, something which could be part of one of those guided walks. I think this is something that we should certainly be looking at, because it was such an important part. Mark knows about this as well. It was such an important part of Plymouth's history during the 19th century.
And hundreds of thousands of Australians are descended from people who embarked from Plymouth.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else who's got anything? Otherwise, I've got one or two announcements at the end. And so, first of all, there's a talk coming up on the Tuesday, the 18th of May. That's at 7 o'clock. A talk on the archaeological complex at Calstock. Dr. Chris Smart from the University of Exeter will be talking about the discovery of the Roman auxiliary fort at Calstock and other aspects of archaeology. There's a possibility of a lost medieval village there, which they've been looking at. And there will be a site visit to the Calstock Roman fort, we hope, at some stage in July. And if anyone wants to revisit today's talk, a recorded version, you probably know this, will be available from Tuesday, May the 11th at 7 o'clock. And so coming to the end, thanks first of all to Rosie Langridge at the Arts Institute for her work on the technical side and for hosting this session. And particular thanks to Liz Rushen for her fascinating talk, a very important period of history. And thanks to all of those of you who've been in the audience with us. If this were a face-to-face talk, we would now give a rousing round of applause to Liz. So thanks to everyone. Goodbye.